What if one single vision could change the destiny of a nation and echo through history for thousands of years? What if the words spoken in a moment of fear, awe, and trembling still shape the hopes of the world today? Long before empires rose and fell, long before Jerusalem became a symbol known across the earth, there lived a man whose life would be marked by fire, silence, judgment, and hope. His name was Isaiah Isaiah was born in the land of Judah during a time when God's people were divided and uncertain. The once unified kingdom had split in two, Israel in the north, Judah in the south. Political tension filled the air. Enemies were growing stronger, faith was weakening, and beneath the surface of prosperity something was quietly rotting. Isaiah grew up in Jerusalem the spiritual heart of the nation. From a young age he learned the laws of God and watched the rhythms of religious life unfold around him. He saw sacrifices, offered prayers spoken, and festivals celebrated. On the outside, everything looked faithful, but Isaiah noticed what others ignored. The people worshiped with their lips, yet their hearts drifted far away. During Isaiah's early years, Judah experienced remarkable success under King Uzziah. The land flourished. The army grew strong. Cities expanded. Food was plentiful. Security felt real. To many, it seemed like proof that God was pleased. But Isaiah saw cracks forming beneath the shine. As wealth increased, so did injustice. The powerful accumulated land and houses while the poor were pushed aside. The rich grew richer, the weak grew quieter. What should have been a nation built on righteousness was slowly becoming a society driven by greed. Worse still, the people began turning to false gods, Statues replaced trust, rituals replaced obedience. The God who had delivered their ancestors from slavery was slowly forgotten. Isaiah felt the weight of it all, but he remained silent, not yet knowing that his voice would soon be demanded. Beyond Judah's borders, a storm was rising. The empire of Assyria was growing stronger by the year. Cities fell before them. Nations trembled. Even Israel, Judah's northern neighbor, faced destruction. Fear spread through Jerusalem like wildfire. People whispered in the streets. Leaders argued behind palace walls. Some believed survival required alliances. Others trusted military power. Many wanted help from Egypt, horses, chariots, soldiers, anything tangible, anything visible. Isaiah knew this fear revealed a deeper problem. The people no longer trusted God to protect them. Then everything changed. In the year King Uzziah died, Isaiah entered the temple. It was a place he knew well, a place of worship, incense, and prayer. But this day would not be like the others. Suddenly, Isaiah saw something that shattered his understanding of reality. Before him stood the Lord high and exalted, seated on a throne so glorious that the hem of his robe filled the temple. Above him were celestial beings blazing with holiness, calling out to one another, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." The sound of their voices shook the foundations. Smoke filled the room. The presence of God was overwhelming. And in that moment, Isaiah did not feel inspired. He felt undone. Confronted by absolute holiness, Isaiah became painfully aware of his own sin and the sin of the people he lived among. He realized something terrifying: no human could stand before such purity and survive unchanged. Isaiah cried out, convinced he was about to be destroyed. But instead of judgment, something unexpected happened. One of the heavenly beings flew to him carrying a burning coal taken from the altar. It touched Isaiah's lips, painful, cleansing, final. His guilt was removed. His sin was forgiven. In that sacred moment, Isaiah was transformed. Then came a voice, not thunderous, not distant, but personal. "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" Isaiah did not hesitate. "Here am I," he said. "Send me." He did not yet know how hard the path would be. He did not yet know how often he would be rejected. He did not yet know how heavy the message would become. But his life would never be the same. And the story of Isaiah, the prophet who saw God, had only just begun. Isaiah answered God's call without knowing the cost. But the mission placed before him would be unlike anything he imagined. God did not send Isaiah with words people wanted to hear. He sent him with truth people would resist. Isaiah was told to speak to a nation that would listen, yet not understand to look at signs yet refuse to see their meaning. His message would be clear, but their hearts would be closed. This was not a calling to popularity. It was a calling to faithfulness. Isaiah asked the question every human heart would ask in that moment. How long, Lord? The answer was unsettling. God revealed that difficult days were coming, cities emptied, homes abandoned, land laid waste. Judgment would fall because the people refused to turn back. Their pride, injustice, and false worship would lead them down a painful path. Yet even in this dark vision, God planted a seed of hope. Like a tree cut down to a stump, a remnant would remain. A small, faithful core through which God would one day bring restoration. This idea, the remnant, would shape Isaiah's entire ministry. From that moment on, Isaiah stepped into the streets of Jerusalem not just as an observer, but as a messenger. He spoke to ordinary people, religious leaders, and powerful kings. His voice echoed through markets, courts, and palace halls. And what he saw disturbed him deeply. The land was filled with idols. People bowed to objects their own hands had made. They trusted statues for protection and ignored the living God. Isaiah warned that this false security would collapse, humbling everyone who relied on it. At the same time, social injustice had become normalized. The wealthy crushed the poor. Leaders exploited the vulnerable. Widows and orphans were forgotten. Isaiah did not soften his words. He accused the nation's leaders directly, declaring that God himself was entering into judgment against them. But Isaiah was not calling for empty religion. He called for repentance, not rituals, not sacrifices, not appearances. He pleaded for clean hearts, justice, compassion, and humility. He reminded the people that true worship was seen in how they treated the weakest among them. To help them understand, Isaiah used powerful imagery. He compared Judah to a carefully planted vineyard. God had done everything, cleared the land, planted the finest vines, built a watchtower, prepared a winepress. Yet when the time came for fruit, the vineyard produced only bitterness. The message was unmistakable: privilege without obedience leads to judgment. As Isaiah spoke, the political situation grew more dangerous. Two neighboring kingdoms, Syria and Israel, formed an alliance and marched toward Jerusalem. Fear seized the city. King Ahaz and his people shook like trees in the wind. God sent Isaiah directly to the king. "Do not be afraid," Isaiah said. "Stay calm. These threats will not stand." Isaiah urged Ahaz to trust God rather than panic. He even told the king to ask God for a sign, anything, no matter how great. But Ahaz refused. Not because of faith, but because of fear. Behind his religious words, Ahaz had already decided to rely on human alliances instead of God. And in response, Isaiah spoke a prophecy that would echo through centuries. A virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and he will be called Emmanuel, God with us. It was a message for that moment, and a promise for the future. Isaiah's role was becoming clear. He was not just warning of judgment. He was pointing towards something greater, someone greater who would come when hope seemed lost. And as kings rose and fell, Isaiah would continue to speak, sometimes ignored, sometimes mocked, sometimes feared, but always faithful. Because once you have seen the holiness of God, once your guilt has been removed, once your life has been claimed by a divine calling, there is no turning back. And the deeper Isaiah walked into his mission, the clearer it became that his words were not only for his own time, but for generations yet to come. As the years passed, Isaiah's voice grew stronger and more dangerous. He was no longer just warning the people. He was challenging the very foundations of their trust. Judah lived in constant fear of Assyria, the most powerful empire the world had ever seen. Its armies were ruthless, its victories unstoppable. Entire nations vanished under its shadow. And with every report of Assyria's advance, panic tightened its grip on Jerusalem. The leaders of Judah searched desperately for safety. Their solutions seemed logical: Egypt, horses, chariots, military strength, a visible shield against an invisible God. But Isaiah stood in their way. He declared that trusting in Egypt was not wisdom, it was rebellion. Relying on human power instead of God would only deepen their downfall. Again and again, Isaiah warned salvation would not come from alliances, weapons, or political strategy. Only God could protect them. Many found this message unrealistic. Some called it dangerous. Others dismissed Isaiah as a dreamer who didn't understand how the world worked. Yet history was moving exactly as Isaiah said it would. During the reign of King Hezekiah, the atmosphere in Judah shifted. Unlike his father, Ahaz, Hezekiah sought to follow God. He tore down idols, restored worship, and listened carefully to Isaiah's counsel. But even a faithful king could not escape crisis. One day Hezekiah fell gravely ill. Isaiah came to him with a devastating message. "Prepare your house, you will not recover." The king turned his face to the wall and wept. He prayed with raw honesty, pleading for mercy, reminding God of his faithfulness. And God answered. Isaiah returned not with judgment but with hope. God had heard the king's prayer. 15 years would be added to his life. Jerusalem would be defended. To confirm this promise, God performed a miracle that defied nature itself. The shadow of the sun moved backward. Time itself seemed to reverse, an unmistakable sign that God held authority over creation, life, and history. But the danger was not over. Assyria eventually marched against Judah. Its armies surrounded Jerusalem. The enemy mocked God openly, boasting that no nation's God had ever stopped them. Fear returned. But this time something was different. Hezekiah did not seek Egypt. He did not seek alliances. He prayed. Isaiah delivered God's response. Assyria would not enter the city. Not a single arrow would strike Jerusalem. And in one night, the impossible happened. The Assyrian army was destroyed. Jerusalem stood. Isaiah's message had been proven true, but his mission was far from finished. He now turned his attention beyond Judah. God gave him messages for other nations, mighty empires that believed themselves untouchable. Babylon, rising in power, would one day fall. Egypt, proud and ancient, would tremble. Damascus, Tyre, Moab, each would face judgment. Isaiah's words revealed a stunning truth. No empire is eternal. No throne stands above God's authority. Yet judgment was never the final word. Isaiah also spoke of a coming day, a future moment, when God would confront all pride, humble all arrogance, and set the world right. He called it the day of the Lord For the proud it would be terrifying, for the faithful it would bring hope. And then Isaiah began to speak of something extraordinary. From the stump of a fallen tree, the line of David, a new shoot would grow. A ruler filled with wisdom, justice, and the Spirit of God himself. Under his reign, the world would change. Enemies would live in peace. Violence would vanish. The earth would be filled with the knowledge of the Lord. Isaiah was no longer just warning of disaster. He was unveiling a vision of restoration, one that stretched far beyond his lifetime. And at the center of that vision stood a mysterious figure. A servant, a king, a deliverer. One whose path would not be marked by conquest, but by suffering. And Isaiah's most unsettling prophecy was still ahead. Isaiah's words began to shift in tone, but not in intensity. After years of warning kings and nations, God revealed to him a vision unlike anything spoken before. It was not about armies or empires. It was not about political collapse or military victory. It was about suffering. Isaiah spoke of a mysterious figure, someone chosen by God, yet rejected by people. A servant who would not rise through power or force, but through pain and obedience. This servant would carry sorrow like a shadow. He would be misunderstood, despised, and counted as nothing. People would turn their faces away from him, convinced that his suffering was punishment from God. But Isaiah revealed a shocking truth. This suffering would not be for his own sins. It would be for ours. The servant would bear pain that did not belong to him. He would be wounded so others could be healed, crushed so others could be forgiven, silent before his accusers, yet innocent beyond measure. Isaiah described this servant as a lamb led to slaughter, submissive, willing, and faithful to the end. To those listening in Isaiah's time, this made no sense. How could deliverance come through suffering? How could victory look like defeat? How could God's chosen one be broken instead of crowned? Yet Isaiah insisted this was God's plan. Through this servant, guilt would be removed. Peace would be restored. Relationship with God would be made possible again. And just as startling as his suffering, was what came next. Isaiah declared that after this servant's agony, he would be exalted. Though cut off, he would somehow see life again. Though rejected, he would be honored by God himself. Death would not be the end of his story. Isaiah's audience could not yet see it, but centuries later these words would echo with terrifying clarity. Still, Isaiah did not allow his message to remain only in the distant future. He turned again to the present. The people of Judah were heading toward exile. Their disobedience would carry consequences. Cities would fall. Families would be displaced. The land would become foreign. But even before exile came, God spoke comfort through Isaiah. "Comfort my people," God said. "Tell them their struggle will end." Isaiah painted a tender image, God as a shepherd gathering his sheep, carrying the weak close to his heart. It was a promise that even in punishment God had not abandoned them. He spoke directly to fear. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through fire, you will not be burned." These were not empty words. They were assurances meant for people who would lose everything. Then Isaiah delivered one of the most surprising revelations of all. God named a future king Cyrus long before he was born. A foreign ruler who did not know God, yet would be used to free God's people and rebuild their homeland. It was proof that God ruled history itself. Kings moved at his command whether they acknowledged him or not. Isaiah's vision expanded again, this time beyond Israel. God's salvation was not meant for one nation alone. Foreigners would come, outsiders would be welcomed. God's house would become a place of prayer for all nations. Then came visions of breathtaking beauty. Deserts blooming with life. Blind eyes opened. Lame bodies restored. Weapons transformed into farming tools. Nations no longer learning war. Isaiah described a world healed inside and out. He spoke of a great banquet where tears would be wiped away and death itself would be swallowed up forever. And finally, Isaiah revealed the ultimate promise. God would create new heavens and a new earth. The former pain would not be remembered. Joy would replace sorrow. Life would flourish without end. What began in a temple vision now reached the edge of eternity. Isaiah's message was clear. Judgment was real, but it was not the end. Suffering had purpose, but it would give way to glory. And through it all, one truth remained unshaken. God was not finished with his people, and he was not finished with the world. As Isaiah's ministry continued, resistance grew louder. Not everyone wanted truth. Many wanted comfort. Others wanted silence. Some leaders openly opposed Isaiah. They told the prophets times, "Stop seeing visions. Stop telling us what is right. Speak pleasant things instead." They preferred reassuring illusions over uncomfortable truth. And Isaiah knew this resistance revealed how deep the nation's sickness had become. Still, he refused to soften the message. Isaiah warned that judgment was not random, it was the natural result of turning away from God. Pride would lead to collapse. Corruption would bring ruin. Trusting power instead of righteousness would end in loss. Yet even while delivering these hard words, Isaiah never lost sight of hope. Again and again, he returned to one powerful idea. God was about to do something new. The people clung to the past, former victories, former traditions, former blessings. But Isaiah told them not to live there. Forget the former things, he proclaimed. Do not dwell on the past. God was making a way in the wilderness. Streams were about to flow through wastelands. This promise was not only about land, it was about hearts. Isaiah revealed that God's restoration would be deeper than rebuilding cities. God would pour his spirit onto dry souls. He would change people from the inside out, creating faith where there had been emptiness and obedience where there had been rebellion. The transformation would be internal before it was external. Isaiah also began to speak in invitations rather than warnings. He called out to the thirsty, to the broken, to those who had nothing to offer. "Come," he declared, "eat without money, drink without cost." God's grace would not be earned. It would be given. This message was radical. In a world built on sacrifice and performance, Isaiah announced that forgiveness and life were freely offered to those who turned back to God. At the same time, Isaiah reminded the people that choices still mattered. God's mercy did not erase responsibility. Trusting in idols, injustice, and political schemes would still bring consequences. But for those who listened, the future was breathtaking. Isaiah described a restored Jerusalem, not just rebuilt but transformed. A city filled with joy instead of sorrow. A place where no sound of weeping would be heard. A home where life flourished fully. This vision was especially powerful for a people facing exile. They would lose their land. They would lose their temple. They would lose their sense of identity. Yet Isaiah assured them exile would not be the end of their story. God would bring them back. More than that, he would elevate them. Nations would come to their light. Kings would be drawn to the brightness of God's glory. What was once destroyed would become a source of hope for the world. Isaiah's message grew even wider. God's plan was never limited to one people group. Foreigners once excluded would be welcomed. Those who sought the Lord would find joy in his presence regardless of their origin. The God of Israel was revealing himself as the God of all nations ***. Isaiah also spoke of a future peace so complete that war itself would disappear. Swords would become tools for farming. Spears would be reshaped into instruments of growth. Nations would no longer train for battle. Violence would no longer define human history. Then Isaiah returned once more to the mysterious figure at the center of everything. The servant, the anointed one, the bearer of good news. This figure would proclaim freedom to captives, healing to the brokenhearted, and light to those trapped in darkness. His mission would be restoration, spiritual, emotional, and physical. Isaiah declared that when this anointed one came, despair would give way to praise and mourning would be replaced with joy. Centuries later, these words would be read aloud in a synagogue and claimed as fulfilled. But Isaiah, standing in his own time, saw only fragments of what was to come. Still he trusted. Through rejection, ridicule, and hardship, Isaiah remained faithful. His obedience was not fueled by success, but by conviction. He had seen God's glory. He had been cleansed. He had been called. And because of that, he continued to speak. Even when the people refused to listen, even when the future looked dark, even when hope seemed fragile, Isaiah knew one thing with certainty. God was still writing the story. And the final chapter would be filled not with destruction, but with renewal, peace, and everlasting joy. As the years passed, Isaiah's voice did not fade. It sharpened. He had spoken of judgment and hope, exile and restoration, suffering and glory. But now his message turned inward, confronting something far more dangerous than foreign armies. The human heart. Isaiah made it clear that Israel's greatest enemy was not Assyria or Babylon. It was pride disguised as religion, ritual without repentance, worship without justice. The people still brought sacrifices. They still sang songs. They still gathered in God's name. But Isaiah delivered God's verdict without hesitation. These people honor me with their lips, God said, but their hearts are far from me. Their hands were lifted in prayer, yet stained with injustice. The poor were ignored. The weak were exploited. The vulnerable were forgotten. And God was not impressed. Isaiah revealed a sobering truth. Religious activity could never replace obedience. God desired mercy more than ceremony, righteousness more than routine. Still, even in this rebuke, hope remained. Isaiah spoke of a future cleansing not with water, but with fire. God would refine his people like precious metal, burning away corruption while preserving what was pure. A faithful remnant would survive, not because they were strong, but because God was faithful. Isaiah described this remnant as humble, dependent, and attentive to God's voice. They would not trust in power or position. They would trust in the Lord alone. From this remnant, something extraordinary would emerge. Isaiah returned once again to the image of the servant, but this time, the focus shifted from suffering to mission. This servant would not shout or crush the weak. He would move gently, restoring what was broken rather than discarding it. A bruised reed would not be snapped. A flickering flame would not be extinguished. This servant would bring justice, not through violence, but through truth. And his influence would reach far beyond Israel. Isaiah declared that coastlands and distant nations were waiting for his teaching. The servant would be a light to the Gentiles, opening blind eyes and freeing captives trapped in darkness. Salvation was expanding outward. God was revealing that his redemptive plan had always been global. Then Isaiah shifted his tone again, this time addressing fear. The future was uncertain. Exile was approaching. The world felt unstable. So God spoke reassurance through Isaiah. "Do not fear," he said. "I have redeemed you. I have called you by name. You are mine." God reminded his people that they were not abandoned. Even in exile, even in suffering, even in loss, he would remain present. "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you walk through fire, you will not be consumed." These were promises not of avoidance but of companionship. Isaiah made it clear God did not promise a pain-free path. He promised his presence through every storm. Then came one of Isaiah's boldest declarations. God challenged the idols of the nations. "Tell me the future," he said. "Declare what is to come." Silence followed. Isaiah exposed idols for what they truly were: lifeless, powerless, unable to save. Only the Lord could declare the end from the beginning. Only the Lord ruled history. To prove this, God did something astonishing. He once again named events before they happened. He spoke of deliverance long before captivity ended. He announced restoration while the people were still broken. God was showing that hope was not wishful, thinking it was anchored in his sovereignty. Isaiah urged the people to respond. "Turn back," he said. "Listen. Trust." God's invitation remained open, even now. Isaiah described what would happen if they did. Joy would replace shame. Peace would overcome fear. God's word would accomplish its purpose, never returning empty. Just as rain waters the earth and produces life, so God's promises would bring transformation. The chapter closed, not with warning, but with celebration. Mountains would burst into song. Trees would clap their hands. Creation itself would rejoice at God's redemption. What began as correction ended in praise. Isaiah's message was consistent to the end. God confronts sin but never without offering grace. God allows suffering but never without purpose. God disciplines but always to restore. And for those willing to listen, even the darkest season could become the doorway to light. The story was far from over. In fact, it was moving toward its most powerful fulfillment yet. As Isaiah's vision stretched further into the future, his words grew both heavier and brighter at the same time. He began to speak of a coming day, a decisive moment when God would no longer tolerate evil, injustice, or deception. It would be a day of reckoning, not driven by anger alone, but by righteousness. Isaiah described it as the asterisk, day of the Lord, asterisk. For the proud, it would be terrifying. For the corrupt, it would be inescapable. For those who trusted in power, wealth, and violence, it would strip away every false security. Human arrogance would be humbled. Earthly glory would fade. Only what was aligned with God's truth would remain. Yet Isaiah was careful to show that this day was not only about judgment, it was also about rescue. For the faithful, the day of the Lord would bring renewal. Isaiah spoke of a righteous king who would reign with justice and wisdom. Unlike the rulers they had known, this king would govern with fairness. He would defend the poor, protect the weak, and establish peace through righteousness rather than force. Under his rule, chaos would give way to order. Fear would give way to safety. Truth would no longer be hidden. Isaiah described this future kingdom in poetic detail. The wolf would dwell with the lamb. The leopard would lie down with the goat. A child would lead them all. It was a picture of harmony so complete that even nature itself would be transformed. Violence would disappear. Hatred would lose its power. Knowledge of the Lord would fill the earth like water fills the sea. Isaiah then revealed the source of this king's authority. He would not rule by inheritance alone. He would rule by the Spirit of God. The Spirit of wisdom, understanding, counsel, power, knowledge, and reverence would rest upon him. His decisions would be guided not by appearances, but by truth. This king would bring a justice the world had never seen. But Isaiah did not allow this vision to remain abstract. He turned again to the people of his own time. "You are living between promise and fulfillment," his message implied. "What will you do while you wait?" Isaiah warned against impatience. Some sought alliances with foreign nations instead of trusting God. Others chased prosperity through injustice. Many assumed that religious identity alone would protect them. Isaiah challenged all of it. True security, he insisted, came from humility and trust, not strategy or strength. He reminded them of past failures, not to shame them, but to teach them. Every time the people trusted themselves instead of God, disaster followed. Every time they returned to the Lord, restoration followed. History itself was the evidence. Isaiah also addressed despair. For those who felt forgotten, crushed, or exhausted, Isaiah spoke words of comfort. Those who wait on the Lord would renew their strength. They would rise like eagles. They would run and not grow weary. They would walk and not faint. Waiting, Isaiah explained, was not passive. It was active trust, a decision to believe that God was at work even when nothing seemed to change. Isaiah then spoke directly to broken leadership. Shepherds who fed themselves instead of the flock would be held accountable. Watchmen who failed to warn would face consequences. God would not ignore abuse of authority, yet even here, hope emerged. God himself would become the shepherd. He would search for the lost. He would bind up the injured. He would strengthen the weak. No failure of human leadership could cancel God's care. As Isaiah's message continued, it became clear that the future was not uncertain. It was intentional. God's plan was unfolding step by step. The righteous king would come. The kingdom of peace would be established. Justice would prevail. But until that day, Isaiah called the people to live differently, to choose righteousness in a corrupt world, to pursue justice in an unjust system, to trust God in seasons of silence. Isaiah's words were not meant only to predict the future. They were meant to shape the present. Every generation would stand between what God had promised and what had not yet fully appeared. And in that space, Isaiah's message still echoed. Do not fear the shaking of the world. Do not envy the power of the proud. Do not lose hope in the waiting, because the same God who promised peace was faithful enough to bring it to pass. As Isaiah's message approached its final movements, his words became deeply personal. He was no longer speaking only to nations or kings, but to wounded individuals, to people worn down by failure, exile, and unanswered prayers. Isaiah understood something: essential hope must reach the heart, not just the future. He spoke of a God who did not merely rule from heaven, but who times dwelt with the humble asterisk, a God who paid attention to the broken spirit and listened to the trembling soul. This was a radical image. Many believe God favored the powerful, the successful, the confident. Isaiah shattered that assumption. God was close to those who felt small, crushed, and forgotten. Isaiah warned that religion without humility was empty. Ritual without compassion meant nothing. God was not impressed by temples built of stone if hearts remained unrepentant. Instead, God desired sincerity. He desired obedience born from love, not fear. He desired repentance that led to transformation, not performance. Then Isaiah returned once more to the theme of contrast. Two paths lay before the people. One path led to pride, doing what was right in one's own eyes, silencing conviction and reshaping truth to fit comfort. That path, Isaiah said, would end in emptiness. The other path led to surrender. Those who listened to God's voice would find peace. Those who trusted him would experience joy, not because life was easy, but because they were no longer alone. Isaiah described the fate of the faithful with vivid imagery. They would inherit joy. They would rejoice in what God created. Their labor would not be in vain. Their children would be blessed. God promised a future where life would no longer be cut short by despair, where people would build and enjoy the work of their hands, where pain would not dominate the story. Then Isaiah revealed one of the most astonishing visions of all. In this coming age, God said harmony would reach even creation itself. The wolf and the lamb would feed together. The lion would eat straw like an ox. Nothing would destroy or harm in all of God's holy mountain. It was a picture of complete restoration, not only human hearts, but the entire world healed from the effects of sin. Isaiah made it clear this was not fantasy. It was promise. But he also warned that not everyone would welcome it. Those who clung to rebellion would find no peace. Those who rejected God's ways would experience separation, not because God desired it, but because they chose it. God's mercy was wide but not forced. Isaiah's message held both invitation and consequence. Then the prophet's voice shifted once more, this time toward urgency. God was calling his people to respond now, not later. Delay carried danger. Indifference carried cost. Isaiah reminded them that life itself was fragile. Time was not guaranteed. Every generation had to choose whom they would trust. The chapter closed with a stark contrast. On one side, comfort, restoration, and life. On the other, unrest, dissatisfaction, and loss. Isaiah did not manipulate. He did not threaten. He presented truth plainly and left the decision in the hands of the listener. As the book neared its conclusion, Isaiah stood as a witness. He had seen God's holiness. He had experienced God's forgiveness. He had delivered God's message faithfully. Not all had listened. Many had resisted. Some had mocked, but Isaiah spoke anyway, because truth was not measured by acceptance. Faithfulness was not determined by applause. Isaiah trusted that God's word would outlive him, that it would reach people far beyond his time, that it would speak to hearts in seasons he would never see. And he was right. His words would echo through centuries. They would be read by exiles longing for home. They would be spoken in synagogues. They would be quoted by prophets, teachers, and eventually by the Messiah himself. Isaiah's story did not end with him. It continued in every person who wrestled with suffering, waited for justice, and longed for redemption. And as his final visions faded, one truth stood unshaken. God was still inviting the world not into fear, but into life, peace, and everlasting hope. Isaiah's message now reached a solemn climax. After visions of restoration, peace, and renewed creation, he turned to confront a truth that could not be ignored. Asterisk, asterisk. Every promise demands a response. Asterisk, asterisk. God had spoken clearly. He had warned. He had invited. He had promised restoration beyond imagination. Yet Isaiah revealed that not all would listen. Some would hear the words and remain unchanged. Others would twist the message, choosing comfort over conviction. And still others would openly resist, believing they could shape their own future without God. Isaiah did not soften what came next. He spoke of consequences, not as revenge, but as reality. Those who rejected God's ways would experience unrest. Their pursuits would never satisfy. Their victories would feel hollow. Even in abundance, they would remain restless. There is no peace, Isaiah declared, for the wicked. This was not meant to condemn, it was meant to awaken. Isaiah wanted the people to understand that peace was not circumstantial, it was relational. It came from alignment with God, not from control over life. At the same time, Isaiah reminded the faithful that God saw them. Those who felt overlooked. Those who suffered quietly. Those who remained obedient while others prospered. God had not forgotten them. Isaiah described how the Lord would act decisively on behalf of justice. He would confront oppression. He would expose hypocrisy. He would intervene where human systems had failed. God himself would step into history not as a distant observer, but as a righteous defender. Isaiah painted a powerful image of God as a warrior clothed in righteousness, fighting not for conquest but for restoration. His goal was not destruction, but redemption. Yet redemption, Isaiah emphasized, would not come cheaply. Evil would be confronted. Pride would be dismantled. False worship would be exposed. Only then could true peace emerge. Isaiah then spoke words of profound reassurance. God's covenant had not failed. Even when the people broke their promises, God remained faithful to his own. His spirit would not depart. His word would not disappear. His purpose would not be undone. This faithfulness extended beyond one generation. Isaiah declared that God's promises were meant for children and grandchildren for generations yet unborn. Hope was not temporary, it was enduring. Then Isaiah returned once more to the theme of transformation. God's salvation was not meant to leave people as they were. It would reshape lives, communities, and ultimately the world. The redeemed would be called servants of righteousness. They would become witnesses to God's goodness, living evidence that restoration was possible. Isaiah envisioned a people no longer defined by shame or failure, but by purpose. They would rebuild what was ruined. They would restore what was broken. They would stand as signs of hope in a wounded world. This calling was not easy. Isaiah made it clear that following God would still involve struggle. Opposition would come, faith would be tested, waiting would be required. But those who trusted the Lord would never be abandoned. Isaiah then lifted his gaze beyond history itself. He spoke of a future gathering, a moment when all nations would see God's glory. People from every land, language, and background would come to worship. This vision shattered every boundary. Faith would no longer be confined to one place. God's name would be known across the earth. His truth would reach the ends of the world. Isaiah even described survivors being sent as messengers, declaring God's glory to distant lands that had never heard his name. The story Isaiah revealed was always meant to be shared, As the message neared its conclusion, Isaiah delivered one final contrast. Some would choose life, others would choose resistance. God would not force obedience, but he would honor choice. The faithful would experience joy and peace. The rebellious would face unrest and loss. The ending was not ambiguous. Isaiah closed with a sobering reminder that God's holiness could not be ignored, and his mercy should not be delayed. The invitation had been given. The future had been revealed. The decision remained. Isaiah's voice faded, but his message endured, a message that still speaks to every generation standing at the same crossroads. Will you trust your own way, or will you trust the God who promises life beyond the present moment? With the message nearly complete, Isaiah's words slowed not in urgency, but in depth. He now spoke as if standing at the threshold between time and eternity, drawing together everything he had seen, heard, and proclaimed. This was no longer only prophecy. It was reflection, a final call to understanding. Isaiah reminded the people that God's ways had always been higher than human ways. Just as the heavens rise above the earth, so God's thoughts rose above human logic, fear, and expectation. What seemed delayed was not forgotten. What appeared broken was not abandoned. What looked like defeat was often the beginning of redemption. This truth challenged everything the people assumed about control. They wanted quick answers. They wanted visible power. They wanted immediate rescue. But Isaiah revealed that God worked through process, patience, and purpose. Seeds were planted long before harvest came. Promises were spoken long before fulfillment appeared. And none of it was wasted. Isaiah returned to the image of God's word. Just as rain falls and does not return to the sky without watering the earth, God's word would never return empty. It would accomplish exactly what God intended, whether people noticed it immediately or not. This was meant to steady, weary hearts. Even when obedience felt invisible, even when faith seemed unrewarded, even when silence felt overwhelming, God was still at work. Isaiah then spoke of joy, not shallow happiness, but deep sustaining joy, the kind that comes not from circumstances but from assurance. Those who trusted in the Lord would go out in peace. They would be led forward with confidence, not because life would be easy, but because their direction was secure. Creation itself, Isaiah said, would respond. Mountains would sing. Trees would clap their hands. It was poetic language, but the meaning was clear. When God restores, the impact is cosmic. Redemption is never small. It always reaches further than expected. Then Isaiah turned to legacy. He spoke of how God's salvation would leave an everlasting sign, something that would not be cut off or forgotten. What God was doing would echo beyond one lifetime, beyond one nation, beyond one moment in history. Isaiah wanted the people to understand they were part of something larger than themselves. Their obedience mattered. Their faith mattered. Their choices would shape generations they would never meet. This realization carried weight. Isaiah acknowledged that not everyone would respond the same way. Some would soften, others would harden. Some would return to the Lord, others would resist until the end. But the responsibility to speak truth did not depend on the outcome. Isaiah himself was living proof. He had proclaimed God's message through rejection, misunderstanding, and danger. He had watched kings ignore wisdom. He had seen his nation move closer to exile, yet he never doubted his calling. Faithfulness, Isaiah demonstrated, was not measured by visible success, but by obedience. Then Isaiah's words turned almost instructional, as if guiding future listeners. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call on him while he is near, not because God was distant, but because hearts could grow deaf. Delay was dangerous. Indifference was costly. Isaiah urged immediate response, not out of fear, but out of opportunity. God's mercy was present. God's invitation was open. God's forgiveness was available. But it would not always feel this close. Isaiah closed this section with quiet confidence. God would finish what he started. The exile would come, but so would return. Suffering would occur, but healing would follow. Death would touch history, but life would have the final word. This was not optimism. It was conviction. Isaiah had seen the Holy One. He had heard the voice. He had carried the message. And now, standing at the edge of his prophetic journey, Isaiah left future generations with a foundation strong enough to endure centuries of waiting. Trust the Lord. Walk in humility. Hold fast to hope. Because even when history seems uncertain, the God who writes it is not. As Isaiah's message moved toward its final resolution, the focus narrowed from nations and generations to the individual soul. After revealing God's power over history, creation, and kings, Isaiah confronted a deeply personal question times. What does this mean for you? Asterisk. He reminded the people that God's invitation had always been open, but it required response. Faith was never inherited automatically. Being part of a chosen nation did not guarantee a changed heart. Each person had to choose. Isaiah spoke honestly about the human tendency to resist that choice. People preferred what was familiar, even when it was broken. They held on to patterns that numbed conviction. They convinced themselves that delay was harmless, that there would always be time later. But Isaiah warned that spiritual numbness did not happen suddenly. It happened slowly through repeated indifference. Hearing without listening, seeing without understanding, knowing truth without acting on it. This condition, Isaiah explained, was more dangerous than open rebellion because it felt safe. Yet Isaiah refused to end in despair. He reminded the people that God specialized in restoring what seemed unreachable. No heart was too hardened, no failure too final, no distance too great. God had already proven this. He forgave rebellion. He restored after exile. He healed after judgment. The same God who disciplined was the God who welcomed return. Isaiah spoke of repentance, not as humiliation, but as freedom. Turning back to God was not about loss. It was about release. Release from guilt, release from fear, release from carrying burdens never meant to be carried alone. Isaiah described God as one who eagerly forgives, not reluctantly. Mercy was not forced from him. It flowed from his nature. Then Isaiah returned to the image of the servant, one final time. This servant would not only bring justice and healing, he would carry the sins of many. He would intercede for those who had gone astray. His obedience would make restoration possible for others. Isaiah's words were heavy with meaning. He spoke of substitution, of sacrifice, of love expressed through suffering. Though Isaiah did not yet see the full picture, he trusted that God's plan of redemption would be complete and sufficient. Then Isaiah addressed the faithful directly, those who felt small in a corrupt world, those who tried to live righteously while surrounded by compromise, those who wondered if obedience was worth the cost. Isaiah assured them God saw everything. No act of faith was wasted. No moment of endurance was ignored. No tear was unnoticed. God's reward, Isaiah said, was not always immediate, but it was certain. He spoke of a future inheritance, a share in God's victory, joy, and peace. Those who aligned themselves with God's purposes would find meaning beyond success or failure in this life. Isaiah also acknowledged suffering. Following God did not guarantee ease. Some would face opposition. Others would endure loss. Faithfulness could be costly, but suffering was not meaningless. God would use it. God would redeem it. God would transform it into testimony. Quote, Isaiah encouraged the people to anchor their hope, not in outcomes, but in God's character. God was faithful. God was just. God was compassionate. These truths did not change with circumstances. As Isaiah's words continued, his tone became almost pastoral, gentle, reassuring, steady. He reminded the people that they were never alone in their journey. God walked with them. God guided them. God strengthened them. Even when the path disappeared into uncertainty, God remained present. Isaiah's message now felt like a hand reaching through time. Do not give up. Do not lose heart. Do not mistake delay for absence, because the same God who began the story was still bringing it to completion. And for those willing to trust him fully, honestly, completely, the end of the story would not be loss, but life restored, hope fulfilled, and peace without end. Isaiah's message now felt like a final turning of the heart. After confronting nations, systems, leaders, and individual souls, he drew attention to one last reality. Asterisk, asterisk. God's story does not end with warning. It ends with purpose. Asterisk, asterisk. Everything Isaiah had spoken pointed toward a future shaped not by chaos but by intention. God was not reacting to human failure. He was redeeming it. Isaiah reminded the people that history itself moved under God's authority. Empires rose and fell, borders shifted, and generations passed, but none of it escaped God's awareness. What seemed random was guided. What felt delayed was timed. What appeared broken was being prepared for restoration. Isaiah challenged the people to stop interpreting life only through what they could see. Human vision was limited. God's vision was complete. Where they saw exile, God saw refinement. Where they saw loss, God saw redirection. Where they saw endings, God saw beginnings. Isaiah then spoke about identity. The people had begun to define themselves by their failures, their captivity, and their shame. Isaiah rejected that narrative completely. "You are my witnesses," God declared through him. Not victims, not forgotten remnants, not discarded people. Witnesses. They were living proof of God's faithfulness, chosen not because they were perfect, but because God was faithful to his promises. Isaiah emphasized that this identity carried responsibility. To live differently, to reflect God's justice, to embody mercy in a harsh world. Their lives were meant to point beyond themselves. Isaiah also addressed weariness. Some had grown tired of believing. Others were exhausted from waiting. Many had lost hope that change would ever come. Isaiah spoke directly into that exhaustion. God did not grow tired. God did not lose strength. God did not abandon his purpose. Even when human strength failed, God remained steady. Those who leaned on him would find renewed endurance, not always in dramatic ways, but in quiet resilience. Strength to stand when everything else collapsed. Courage to remain faithful when compromise felt easier. Isaiah reminded them that waiting was not wasted time. Waiting shaped trust. Waiting refined faith. Waiting prepared hearts for what was coming. Then Isaiah's words turned again toward the future, clearer, now more focused. He spoke of a final restoration that would surpass everything before it. This future would not simply repair what was broken, it would transform it. Former pain would lose its power. Past shame would no longer define identity. Even memory of suffering would fade in the presence of joy. Isaiah described a world reordered by God's presence. People would live without fear. Work would be meaningful, not draining. Life would no longer be fragile and fleeting. God himself would rejoice over his people. This image reversed everything they believed about judgment. God was not distant. God was not cold. God delighted in restoration. Isaiah then returned briefly to warning not to threaten, but to clarify. This future belonged to those who chose alignment with God's ways. Pride, violence, and rebellion could not coexist with God's peace. God's invitation was open, but it was not neutral. To accept it meant transformation. To reject it meant separation. Isaiah refused to blur that line. He wanted the people to understand that hope was real, but it required honesty, humility, and trust. As Isaiah's prophetic voice softened, his message became almost timeless. Every generation would stand where Judah stood, between fear and faith, between self-reliance and surrender, between resisting God's voice and responding to it. The circumstances would change. The challenges would look different, but the choice would remain the same. Isaiah ended this portion of his message with quiet certainty. God would be faithful. God would finish what he began. God's promises would outlast kingdoms, cultures, and centuries. Those who trusted him would not be disappointed. The future was not uncertain. It was unfolding exactly as intended. And though Isaiah's words were spoken long ago, they still carried the same invitation forward through time. Lift your eyes. Release your fear. Trust the God who holds the end and walks faithfully with you through the middle. Isaiah's voice now reached its quiet conclusion, not with spectacle, but with clarity. After unveiling God's plan across generations, he returned to the simplest and most powerful truth of all. Asterisk, asterisk. God desires relationship, not distance. Asterisk, asterisk. Everything Isaiah had spoken, judgment, restoration, suffering, glory, flowed from this desire. God was not speaking merely to be heard. He was calling to be known. Isaiah reminded the people that God's nearness was not limited by geography, exile, or circumstance. Even far from their land, far from their temple, and far from what once felt familiar, God remained close. Heaven is my throne, God declared, and the earth is my footstool. No structure could contain him. No boundary could restrict him. No distance could separate his presence from those who sought him. Yet Isaiah revealed something astonishing. The God who filled the universe paid special attention to the humble and contrite. He listened to those who trembled at his word, not out of fear, but out of reverence. This redefined what it meant to belong to God. It was not about position, not about power, not about performance. It was about posture. Isaiah then confronted the illusion of control. People believed they could manage their lives independently, choosing parts of God's instruction while ignoring others. Isaiah exposed the emptiness of selective obedience. God desired the whole heart. Half trust led to half peace. Partial surrender led to inner conflict. True rest, Isaiah insisted, came only through full alignment with God's ways. Still, God's tone was not harsh. Isaiah emphasized that God's patience was immense. He had extended mercy again and again, sending prophets, warnings, and invitations. Judgment only came after persistent refusal. This revealed God's character. He was slow to anger, rich in compassion, committed to restoration. Isaiah spoke directly to those who felt excluded or forgotten. Some believed their past disqualified them. Others assumed their failures placed them beyond grace. Isaiah rejected both ideas. God's mercy was not limited by history. Foreigners who sought the Lord would be welcomed. Those once distant would find joy in God's presence. Faith, not ancestry, defined belonging. This was revolutionary. Isaiah described a future where worship would no longer be restricted by walls or rituals alone. God's name would be honored across the earth. People from every nation would gather not out of obligation, but out of desire. Isaiah then returned to the theme of joy. God promised to rejoice over his people like a parent over a child. This was not distant approval, it was delight. Their suffering had not gone unnoticed. Their faith had not been wasted. Their waiting had not been in vain. God would replace shame with honor. God would exchange sorrow for gladness. God would transform mourning into praise. Isaiah acknowledged that not everyone would accept this invitation. Some would cling to rebellion. Others would reject correction. God would respect their choice, but separation would follow. This was not cruelty, it was consequence. Isaiah made it clear peace could not coexist with defiance. But for those who listened, the promise was breathtaking. A renewed world, a restored people, an unbroken relationship with God. Isaiah's words now felt less like prophecy and more like a farewell. He had delivered the message entrusted to him. He had spoken truth to power. He had comforted the broken. He had revealed a future shaped by God's faithfulness. And now Isaiah left the outcome where it belonged, in God's hands. He trusted that God's word would continue working long after his voice was silent, that it would reach hearts in seasons he would never witness, that it would guide people standing at crossroads yet to come. Isaiah's message closed with this unspoken certainty. God does not abandon what he begins. God does not forget what he promises. God does not fail those who trust him. The story Isaiah told was not finished. It was still unfolding, generation by generation, life by life. And for every person willing to listen, it carried the same invitation it always had. Come near, lay down fear, choose life. Because the God who calls you is faithful enough to carry you all the way to the end. Isaiah's message now settled into its final perspective, one that looked beyond prophecy and into responsibility. After revealing who God is and what God will do, Isaiah pressed a final truth upon his listeners. Asterisk, asterisk. Revelation always leads to response. Asterisk, asterisk. Knowing God's plans was never meant to satisfy curiosity. It was meant to change the way people lived. Isaiah reminded them that light had been given. They could no longer claim ignorance. They could no longer hide behind uncertainty. God had spoken clearly about justice, mercy, humility, and hope. The question was no longer times, what will God do times? The question was, times, how will you live now? Asterisk. Isaiah confronted complacency. Some believed that future restoration excused present compromise. Others assumed that because God promised redemption, their choices no longer mattered. Isaiah dismantled that thinking. Hope was not permission to drift. Grace was not a license to ignore righteousness. Instead, God's promises were meant to awaken responsibility. Isaiah called the people to become what they were waiting for. If they longed for justice, they were to live justly. If they hoped for peace, they were to pursue peace. If they trusted God's future, they were to reflect his character in the present. Faith, Isaiah insisted, was visible. It showed itself in how the powerful treated the weak, in how the wealthy responded to the poor, in how truth was spoken when lies were easier. Isaiah returned to the image of the watchman. A watchman did not control the outcome, but he was responsible to sound the warning. Silence in the face of danger was itself a form of guilt. Isaiah had fulfilled that role. Now the responsibility passed to the people. What they did with the message would shape their future. Isaiah also addressed discouragement. Living faithfully in a broken world was exhausting. Righteousness often felt unrewarded. Injustice seemed to thrive. Isaiah acknowledged this pain, but he reminded them that God saw the full picture. What looked like loss was often obedience. What felt like delay was often protection. What seemed unseen was recorded by God. Isaiah reassured the faithful that endurance was not wasted effort. God honored perseverance even when the results were invisible. Then Isaiah lifted their vision once more. He reminded them that God's promised future was not abstract, it was certain. A restored creation, a healed humanity, a world where fear no longer ruled. This future belonged to God, but they were invited to anticipate it through their lives. Isaiah urged them not to conform to the patterns around them. Nations would rise and fall, cultures would redefine truth, power would shift. But God's standard remained unchanged. Righteousness, justice, faithfulness. Isaiah emphasized that allegiance to God would often place them at odds with their surroundings. But compromise, he warned, always carried a higher cost than obedience. He spoke with clarity, not threat. Those who aligned with God would find stability even in upheaval. Those who resisted would experience unrest even in success. Isaiah's words now carried the weight of final instruction. Choose humility over pride. Choose truth over convenience. Choose trust over fear. Not once, but daily. This, Isaiah revealed, was how God's people survived exile, suffering, and uncertainty, not by controlling the future, but by trusting the one who did. As the message drew closer to its end, Isaiah's tone softened again. He reminded them that they were not walking this path alone. God's Spirit would guide them. God's presence would sustain them. God's mercy would meet them when they stumbled. Faithfulness was not perfection. It was persistence. Isaiah had walked that road himself, speaking when ignored, standing when rejected, trusting when outcomes were unclear. Now he passed that calling forward to the next generation, and the next, and the next. Because the story God was telling was bigger than one prophet, one nation, or one moment in time. It was a story still unfolding, and every listener now stood within it, holding a choice that Isaiah had made long before. To hear God's voice, to trust his promises, and to live as if his future was already on the way. As Isaiah's story approached its final horizon, everything narrowed to a single defining truth. Asterisk, asterisk. God's future was certain, but humanity's response remained open. Asterisk, asterisk. Isaiah had spoken of judgment and mercy of exile, and restoration of suffering and glory. He had warned nations and comforted the broken. He had lifted his voice against kings and knelt before God in humility. Now his message rested on one last tension. Asterisk, asterisk. The space between promise and fulfillment. Asterisk, asterisk. Because even when God speaks, waiting is required. Isaiah understood this deeply. Many of the promises he proclaimed would not be fulfilled in his lifetime. Some would unfold generations later. Others would stretch far beyond what his audience could imagine. And yet Isaiah never treated delay as doubt. Waiting, he taught, was not weakness, it was trust in motion. God's people would have to live between what had been spoken and what had not yet appeared. They would have to hold hope while walking through uncertainty. Isaiah prepared them for that reality. He reminded them that faith was not sustained by visible proof, but by confidence in God's character. History had already shown who God was: a deliverer, a restorer, a keeper of covenant. God had never abandoned his people, not in Egypt, not in the wilderness, not in exile, and not now. Isaiah urged the people to remember this when circumstances grew dark. Empires would rise, Jerusalem would fall, captivity would come. but none of it meant that God had lost control. Isaiah reframed suffering. Hardship was not evidence of God's absence, but often the setting in which his purposes matured. Pain refined faith. Waiting deepened dependence. God was not merely rescuing his people times from time's history. He was shaping them times through time's ed. Isaiah also spoke about identity. Exile, oppression, and loss would tempt the people to forget who they were. Surrounded by foreign gods and foreign values, they would feel pressure to blend in to survive by compromise. Isaiah warned against this. They were not defined by geography, not defined by power, not defined by circumstance. They were defined by covenant. They belonged to God. And that identity carried responsibility. They were called to be witnesses to reflect God's justice, mercy, and faithfulness, even in lands that did not acknowledge him. Isaiah reminded them that God's light was never meant to be hidden. Even in darkness, it was meant to shine. He also spoke tenderly to those who would feel forgotten, those who would cry out in exile, those who would pray and feel unheard, those who would wonder if the promises still applied to them. Isaiah reassured them, asterisk, asterisk. God's silence was not abandonment. Asterisk, asterisk. God was working beyond what they could see. Seeds were being planted. Paths were being prepared. Hearts were being shaped. And at the appointed time, God would act. Isaiah returned once more to the figure of the coming servant, the one who would embody God's purpose fully. This servant would not rush God's timing. He would walk in obedience even through suffering. Isaiah's words hinted again at a redemption that would cost something precious, but would result in freedom for many. This hope sustained Isaiah himself. He knew that his obedience might not be celebrated. His warnings might be ignored. His faithfulness might seem ineffective. But Isaiah trusted that God measured success differently. Faithfulness mattered more than popularity. Truth mattered more than comfort. Obedience mattered more than results. Isaiah's life became the message he preached. Stand firm, speak truth, even when outcomes are delayed. As his prophetic voice quieted, Isaiah left behind more than predictions. He left behind a posture, a way of living, grounded in hope, anchored in trust, and shaped by faithfulness. He had seen God's holiness. He had experienced God's mercy. He had carried God's message. Now the future rested in God's hands. And Isaiah believed with unwavering confidence that those hands were faithful. No matter how long fulfillment took, no matter how dark the waiting became, God's promises would stand. Because the story was never about speed, it was always about trust. And so the voice of Isaiah slowly fades from history, but his message does not. What began with a young man in Jerusalem, living in a divided kingdom, ends with a vision that stretches beyond time itself. Isaiah saw more than events. He saw meaning. He saw the hand of God moving steadily through chaos, judgment, mercy, and hope. Isaiah's life reminds us of something essential. Asterisk, asterisk. God is never absent from history, even when he seems silent. Asterisk, asterisk. Kingdoms rose and fell around Isaiah. Leaders made reckless choices. People chased false security, trusted in power, wealth, and alliances. Yet through it all, God remained sovereign. Isaiah stood in the middle of that tension between fear and faith, between human failure and divine faithfulness. He was not chosen because he was perfect. He was chosen because he was willing. When Isaiah saw the holiness of God, he recognized his own brokenness. When God purified him, Isaiah responded with surrender times. Here am I, send me, asterisk. That single moment defined everything that followed. Isaiah's calling was not easy. He spoke truths people did not want to hear. He warned of judgment when they wanted comfort. He called for repentance when they preferred religion without change. And yet Isaiah also carried some of the most beautiful promises ever spoken. Promises of healing, promises of restoration, promises of a coming Savior. He spoke of a servant who would suffer so others could be healed, a ruler who would bring justice without cruelty, a kingdom where peace would replace violence and sorrow would give way to joy. Isaiah looked forward to a world made new, a world where tears are wiped away, where injustice is answered, where death itself is defeated. He believed that God's final word would not be judgment but renewal, and that belief sustained him. Isaiah never lived to see many of these promises fulfilled, but he trusted the one who made them. That trust is what connects Isaiah's story to ours. Because we too live in a world filled with uncertainty. We see injustice that feels unchecked. We experience loss that feels unfair. We wait for answers that seem delayed. And like Isaiah's generation, we face a choice. Will we trust in what we can control, or in the God who controls all things? Isaiah challenges us to look beyond the immediate and anchor our hope deeper. He reminds us that faith is not passive. It shapes how we live, how we treat others, how we respond to fear. Faith listens when the world shouts. Faith stands when the crowd moves away. Faith trusts even when the path is unclear. Isaiah's message is not locked in the past. It speaks into our present. It calls us to seek justice, not convenience, to choose humility over pride, to trust God's promises over human solutions. And above all, it invites us into hope, not shallow optimism, but enduring hope grounded in God's character. The same God Isaiah saw in the temple, the same God who forgave, restored, and promised, is the same God who still speaks today. The story did not end with Isaiah. It continues through every life willing to listen, to trust, and to respond. So the question Isaiah leaves us with is simple but powerful. When God calls, when truth is revealed, when hope is offered, asterisk, asterisk, how will we respond? Asterisk, asterisk. If this journey through the life and message of Isaiah has spoken to you, don't let it end here. Share this story, reflect on it, and if you want to explore more powerful stories from the Bible that still speak to our world today, asterisk, asterisk, subscribe to the channel, asterisk, asterisk, and join us on this journey. Because the words of Isaiah remind us of one unchanging truth. Even in the darkest times, asterisk, asterisk, God's light is still rising. Asterisk, asterisk,